3 hours before Jim Morrison took the stage, he was finishing his third bottle of Jack Daniels backstage. Band members Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore watched with concern. Morrison had been losing control over the past 6 months. Alcohol was no longer the fuel that fueled his creativity. It was the poison that was destroying him. But no one could have predicted what would happen that night in Miami. When Morrison took the microphone, 12,000 fans were expecting "Break On Through." Instead, they witnessed 50 minutes of chaos. And with his actions, Morrison began to end not only his career, but also his life. When he was found dead in Paris 2 years later, no autopsy was performed, but Morrison's true cause of death began that night in Miami. If you want to hear this story to the end, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Because what Morrison did that night in Miami will reveal one of rock history's darkest secrets. On the morning of March 1st, 1969, when Morrison left his home in Los Angeles, Pamela Courson tried to stop him at the door. Pamela saw something in Morrison's eyes, that familiar, dangerous gleam. "Don't go, Jim," Pamela said, but Morrison had already walked out the door. When he boarded the plane, he had only a leather bag with him, containing bottles of whiskey, poetry notebooks, and something else no one knew about, a farewell letter he had written to Courson. Morrison wasn't just going to Miami that morning to perform. He had something else on his mind, and this thought had been gnawing at him for weeks. Ray Manzarek would confess years later. "When Jim said last concert to us that morning, we thought he was joking, but he really meant it." Backstage at the Miami Dinner Key Auditorium, concert organizer Ken Collier was anxiously checking his watch. Morrison's plane had landed 2 hours late, and he was still nowhere to be found backstage. What Collier didn't know was that after leaving the airport, Morrison had gone straight to a bar. In a small dive bar in Coconut Grove, Morrison was drinking whiskey and reading poems by Rimbaud to a local waitress. "The man's eyes were different," the waitress would say years later. It was as if something inside him had died, but his body was still moving. Morrison drank 7 more glasses of whiskey that afternoon and didn't arrive at the venue until 7 in the evening. But by then, he was no longer Morrison. He was under the influence of alcohol and something else. When the band members saw him, they froze. Morrison was still talking, his eyes unfocused, and he had tried to put his leather pants on backwards. It was 7:15, and 12,000 people in the auditorium were chanting, "Light my fire." But backstage, Morrison was leaning against the wall, mumbling with his 4th bottle of whiskey in his hand. Ray Manzarek approached Morrison and took him by the shoulder. "Jim, you have to go on stage," Manzarek said. Morrison lifted his head, and Manzarek saw something he would never forget. Morrison had a smile on his face, but his eyes were completely empty. "Ray," Morrison said, "I'm going to do something tonight, and none of you can stop me." Manzarek didn't understand what he meant, but he had a bad feeling. Morrison downed the bottle in one gulp and staggered toward the stage. When the spotlights came on, the crowd went wild. But when Morrison grabbed the microphone, he didn't start any song. Instead, he leaned into the mic and uttered his first words, "You're all a bunch of crazy idiots." The crowd thought it was a joke at first, but Morrison continued. Curses, insults, and words no one expected to hear at a rock concert poured from Morrison's mouth. Robbie Krieger started playing his guitar, perhaps hoping the music would bring Morrison back to normal. But instead of singing, Morrison began pacing the stage and pointed the microphone at the crowd. "Do you want to see the truth?" Morrison shouted. "Let me show you what a real rock star looks like." And then he did something that would be etched into the lives of everyone there that night forever. Morrison took off his shirt and threw it onto the front of the stage. The crowd screamed, but Morrison wasn't done. He started unbuckling his leather pants. The band members panicked. John Densmore stopped playing the drums. Manzarek was yelling at Morrison, but Morrison couldn't hear him over the music and the screams, or maybe he didn't want to. Morrison's hands were on the belt buckle, the crowd watching half in curiosity, half in shock, and at that very moment, something happened at the back door of the venue. 2 officers from the local police department entered through the door. One said something into his radio, but no one, neither the band members, nor the crowd, nor Morrison, had yet noticed the police were there. When Morrison unzipped his pants, panic began in some parts of the auditorium. People were screaming, some running towards the stage, others heading for the exits. But Morrison knew what he was doing. He had planned it for that moment. Because Morrison wasn't just giving a concert that night. He was making a statement, settling scores with the system and confronting the demons in his head. "Here's the real thing," Morrison shouted from the center of the stage. "Here's the rock star you worship, just flesh, blood, and bone." And then, when he put his hand inside his pants, the security guards at the front of the venue started running toward the stage. Ray Manzarek left the keyboard and ran towards Morrison. Robbie Krieger put his guitar down. John Densmore buried his head in his hands. And at that very moment, Morrison did something that witnesses still debate 50 years later. Some witnesses claimed Morrison was actually naked. Some said he only made suggestive gestures. Some claimed they saw nothing, only verbal abuse. But the truth is, no one knew for sure what happened in that dark, crowded, chaotic environment. When the FBI files were released years later, there were 54 different witness statements, and all 54 were different. But they all agreed on one thing. Morrison had crossed a line that night, and there was no turning back. While Morrison stood in the middle of the stage, the venue was completely out of control. Some fans were trying to get on stage, some were fighting, some were crowding the exit doors. Security tried to pull Morrison off the stage, but he resisted. "No!" Morrison shouted. "I'm not done yet. I have things to show you." Manzarek grabbed Morrison's arm and whispered something in his ear. Morrison paused for a moment, looked at Manzarek, and then started laughing. But this was no normal laugh. It was hysterical, uncontrolled, almost mixed with crying. And at that very moment, Morrison's legs began to shake. A mixture of alcohol and adrenaline had taken over his body. Morrison staggered to the edge of the stage, fell to his knees, and dropped the microphone to the floor. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Everyone watched, wondering what Morrison would do. Morrison slowly got to his feet, picked up the microphone, and uttered his final words. "I'm not like you. I'm dead, and a dead man owes you nothing." Then he threw the microphone to the ground, grabbed his leather jacket, and started running toward the venue's back door. The band members ran after him, but Morrison was too fast. When he exited the back door, police officers waiting there moved to stop him. But Morrison passed them too and disappeared into the darkness of the Miami night. While the 12,000 people left inside the venue tried to understand what had happened, Ken Collier was on the phone backstage. He had to call his lawyers because this night was going to end very badly. Morrison ran 3 blocks and finally stopped behind a gas station. He was out of breath, his hands were shaking, and his head was spinning. He took a cigarette out of his pocket, lit it, and inhaled the smoke. Just then, a car pulled up beside him. Vince Trenner, the Doors road manager, was at the wheel. "Get in the car, Jim," Trenner said. Morrison sat silently in the back seat. Trenner looked at Morrison in the mirror, and what he saw frightened him. Morrison's face was mask-like, no emotion, no expression. "Jim, do you know what you've done?" Trenner asked. Morrison didn't answer, just stared out the window. As the city lights of Miami passed by, only one thought crossed Morrison's mind. There was no turning back now. Trenner drove Morrison to the Carillon Hotel. They got their room key and went up to the 3rd floor. When Morrison entered the room, he headed straight for the minibar. Trenner tried to stop him, but Morrison pushed him away. "Don't touch me," Morrison said. "I just want to rest a little." Trenner left the room to look for the band members. An hour later, Manzarek, Krieger, and Densmore arrived at the hotel. They knocked on Morrison's door but got no answer. Reception brought a spare key, and what they saw when they entered the room shocked them. Morrison was sitting fully clothed in the bathtub, holding an empty whiskey bottle, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Jim!" Manzarek shouted. Morrison slowly turned and said something the band members would never forget. "I died today, Ray. Jim Morrison died in Miami. Whoever is here now is someone else." The next morning, Morrison's name was on the front pages of Miami newspapers. Headlines like "Rock Star Causes Scandal in Miami," "Immorality at Concert," and "Doors Vocalist to be Arrested" were on the newsstands. When Morrison turned on the TV in his hotel room, he saw himself on local news channels. Reporters were interviewing people in front of the venue, and eyewitnesses were giving conflicting accounts. But they all agreed on one thing: Morrison had broken the law and would pay the price. Manzarek sat down next to Morrison and placed the newspaper in front of him. "Jim, this is serious," Manzarek said. "The prosecution will charge you indecency, obscenity, performing drunk. There are penalties for these." Morrison didn't even pick up the newspaper. He just looked out the window. "I know, Ray," Morrison said quietly. "I wanted this anyway." 4 days later, the Miami-Dade County Prosecutor's Office took action. 4 separate charges: lewd conduct in a public place, public exposure, use of obscene language, and drunkenness. Morrison had returned to Los Angeles, but the state of Florida wanted him. An FBI file was opened. This was no longer just a local incident. It had become a federal investigation. When Morrison's lawyer, Max Fink, called, the news was bad. "Jim, you need to go back to Miami. If you don't turn yourself in, they're going to issue an arrest warrant." Morrison was silent on the phone. Pamela Courson was sitting next to him and could see how his hand was shaking. "When?" Morrison asked. "You have a week," said Fink. Morrison hung up the phone and turned to Pamela. "It's over," said Morrison. "It's all over." On April 9th, 1969, Morrison returned to Miami and turned himself in. He was photographed at the police station. Those famous mugshot photos would become one of the iconic images of rock history for years to come. The rebellious sparkle was gone from Morrison's eyes, replaced by the weight of exhaustion and resignation. After being released on bail, Morrison discussed his court strategy with his lawyer. Fink's plan was simple: exploit inconsistencies in witness statements, mention Morrison's alcohol problem to gain sympathy, and most importantly, prove that Morrison wasn't actually naked. But there was a problem. There wasn't enough light at the venue that night, and no one had taken a clear photo. Everything depended on witness statements, and these statements didn't match. The court proceedings lasted a full 8 months. Morrison attended every hearing, listened to every witness statement, and withdrew a little more each day. He halted the recording of other Doors albums and cancelled concert tours. No one wanted Morrison on stage anymore. The Miami incident had brought about the end of the Doors. On August 8, 1970, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. He was acquitted of 2 charges, but found guilty of obscenity and use of obscene language. The sentence: 6 months in prison and a $500 fine. Morrison sat motionless in the courtroom. As the judge read the verdict, only one thought crossed Morrison's mind. There's no escape now. The appeal process began, but Morrison knew it was only delaying the inevitable. Escape to Paris and the end. In March 1971, Morrison made a decision. He would go to Paris. He would flee America with Pamela Courson, start a new life, and stop being Jim Morrison. "I'm not a singer anymore," Morrison said in a final interview. "I'm a poet, and I'll write poetry in Paris." On March 11th, Morrison and Pamela boarded a plane. The other members of the Doors were not at the airport. Morrison hadn't told anyone. He had only left a letter for Manzarek. "Ray, the man who died in Miami wasn't me. I died long ago. Maybe I'll be reborn in Paris." As the plane took off, Morrison looked out the window at Los Angeles for the last time, and tears began to roll down his cheeks. During his first months in Paris, Morrison really seemed to have changed. He grew a beard, gained weight, and forgot about his leather pants in the closet. He rented a small apartment in the Marais district and sat in cafes every day writing poetry. Pamela saw Morrison happy for the first time in years. "Jim is different here," Pamela wrote to a friend in Los Angeles. "He doesn't drink anymore, he doesn't do drugs, and he seems peaceful." But the reality was very different. Morrison hadn't given up drinking, he just hid it. Every morning while Pamela slept, Morrison would leave the apartment and drink whiskey at a nearby bar. And in Paris, Morrison encountered something else: heroin. No one knows exactly how it started, but by July, Morrison was using twice a day. On the morning of July 3, 1971, Pamela Courson found Morrison in the bathroom. He was lying motionless in the bathtub, in the hot water. Pamela started screaming, shaking Morrison, but he didn't respond. She ran to call an ambulance, but when she returned, she noticed something. There was a strange smile on Morrison's face. It was as if he was at peace, as if he was finally experiencing the moment he had been waiting for. By the time the doctors arrived, it was too late. Jim Morrison had died at the age of 27 in Paris, in a bathtub. Official cause: heart failure. But no autopsy was performed. Pamela had refused it. And this decision sparked 50 years of speculation. Overdose, suicide, murder. No one knows for sure because Morrison's body was never examined. Morrison was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery on July 6th. Only a few people attended the ceremony: Pamela, a few Parisian friends, and an official from the American consulate. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore couldn't make it to Paris. They received the news of Morrison's death too late. Years later, Manzarek would say, "I wish I could have seen Jim one last time. I wish I could have told him I forgave him for Miami. But I never got the chance." Morrison's grave is now one of the most visited spots in Père Lachaise. Millions of fans come every year to pay their respects to Morrison. But none of them know what really happened that night in Miami. None of them understand what was going through Morrison's mind. And perhaps that's for the best, because some secrets should be taken to the grave. 3 years after Morrison died, Pamela Courson also died at the same age, 27. Overdose. Morrison and Pamela had a joint will and left everything to each other. But when both died, Morrison's estate, music rights, royalties, personal belongings led to a long legal battle. That night in Miami, Morrison didn't just destroy his career. He created a mess that future generations would fight over. In 2007, the governor of Florida granted Morrison a posthumous pardon. But by then, Morrison had been dead for 36 years. Too late. It was too late for everything. Today, what remains of Morrison is his music, his poetry, his legends, and that Miami night, one of the most controversial moments in rock history. Some see Morrison as a genius, some remember him as a tragic figure, and some simply view him as an alcoholic who lost control. But they all agree on one thing. That night in Miami was a turning point, and Morrison was never the same after it. Perhaps Morrison wanted it that way. Perhaps he deliberately tried to destroy everything that night. Because, as he wrote in one of his poems, some people are born, live, and die, but some are only meant to burn. Morrison burned in Miami and turned to ashes in Paris, and all that remains are memories.